Good day to you. Do you remember those teenage years when you were starting to separate from your parents and how you would have maybe some arguments? Some of you may have not had that kind of situation when you were splitting from your parents in essence, but others of you, I'm pretty sure most of you in the class did have that kind of angst. It was difficult to separate from the parents and there were arguments. And I don't know if you ever reached the conclusion in your head that, I just can't go any further with my mom or dad because we don't speak the same language. What you're really saying, if you're saying that inside of your head, or even if you say it out loud, is the way that you speak about the world is constructed from two totally different sets of rules. And so maybe you're using words and rules and signs and symbols from, let's say, the hip hop generation. And maybe your parents are using words and signs and symbols from, say, the 1950s or the 1960s or the 1970s. And the two just clash. And you don't know their language and they don't know yours. They may say to you something like, "Oh, that's really cool," trying to connect with you. And that's not the way that you express that you like something. You may say something that's the bomb. And it's just a completely different set of rules. And so that's what today's class is all about. It's all about language as a barrier to communication. And we start off with the idea of what language is. Language is a set of symbols that are shared by a community to communicate meaning. So it's a set of symbols, and those symbols can be words, but they can be other things as well. For example, the stop sign, the octagon that's red, that's used in many places throughout the world, and that's a kind of a language as well. The red meaning halt, at least in our culture and some others, and also this idea of an octagon making you recognize it rather than a triangle. That's a symbol as well. And in certain tribes in Africa, when they speak, they use a clicking sound in their voice. It almost sounds like those are symbols as well. So we're talking about all the means of human expression as symbols, and as long as they are shared by a particular community in a particular location, and that location doesn't have to be geographic because of the web today. That location can also be people who all subscribe to a particular hobby or interest on the internet, and they were discussing it in blogs, etc. That community also can be sharing a language that's communicating meaning. Certainly video gamers, they're using a language when they are playing the latest video game that they're playing, combat games, etc. They have a certain language that they and they alone speak, and it's because of their connection through video gaming. So that's what we're going to discuss in today's video lecture. And one of the first things that we want to talk about is the SapirWhorf Hypothesis. The SapirWhorf Hypothesis was developed by a researcher named Whorf, and he went down into the southwest of the United States and studied some of the Native American tribes. And he determined that the world as a person knows it is determined by their language. So it's saying that whatever language you grow up with determines the world as you see it. But we know that that's a thesis or a hypothesis, depending on how you want to refer to it, that has been challenged. Fred Yonk talks about that in the book. But right now we want to introduce it because language does constrain the way that we think. In fact, if you study communication at a graduate level here in the United States, you will often learn very early on that language is thought. And I hope to demonstrate that to you in this lecture today, that language is not just the way that we express ourselves, it's actually our thought processes. And so we're doing all of this in today's video lecture because we want to overcome those barriers that get in between cultures when they communicate, barriers in this case that are related to language. And Fred Yonk identifies two levels of barriers. One level of barriers has to do with translation problems. I often look at, for example, I was in a hospital recently visiting a friend, and they had Fox News on, and there was a ticker tape going on down below with words about the latest breaking news. And I just knew right away that a lot of times when you're discussing conflict in the Middle East, we are relying on an English translation of what has been said by an Arabic leader or by an Israeli leader or by another leader in the region. And I just know from experience that sometimes there is no direct translation for the way that something is said. And the book has plenty of examples of that in the chapter, many examples that have gone wrong for people. Some of them are funny, yeah, but some of them are not. And what it's speaking to is that there is a barrier. You cannot translate word for word Spanish into English or Slovakian into French. You can't do it. There's a different set of rules and structures in place, and sometimes words have different meaning. The second level of barrier to communication is imperialism. And that's where you are enforcing your language upon a community that doesn't want to speak it. This is a kind of a dialogue that we have in the United States all the time about Spanish. It's projected that by the year 2050, that the majority of Americans will be able to speak Spanish because of the huge influx of immigrants from Central and South America. Imperialism is the idea of putting down a language and saying, no, English has to be the first language. In this case, that's imperialism. But we've also seen that in plenty of other countries as well. In fact, in China, there's still a lot of dispute about what should be the language. What we think of as Chinese is most of us is thinking of as Mandarin Chinese. That's only one kind of the Chinese language, and actually it's one of the reasons that China took so long to unite as a country, because it did not have a national language. And when you get a national language, you've got an imperialistic language taking over and saying it's going to be the dominant language. And so that's a barrier to intercultural communication. So now let's move on. Let's talk about vocabulary to start things off as we go through some of the more detailed points having to do with language as a barrier to intercultural communication. When we talk about vocabulary, we just know that words in and of themselves, those discrete units of describing things, different languages have different, how should we say, degrees of words that they can use to describe things. And one of the easiest and most common examples of this is that we often say that the Eskimos have 50 words for snow. 50 words for snow, whereas here in Pennsylvania, where we had a lot of snow this year, we maybe have 3, 4, 5 ways of describing sleet, ice, packed snow, etc. The Eskimos have over 50 words. They're living in the north of Canada, some of them, and they're dealing with snow most of their lives. And so they've developed a vocabulary to describe fine, granular snow versus really wet, sloppy, big flake snow. And they have one word that will describe those differences. We also know that in the Philippines, there's a tribe called the Hanunus, and they have 92 words for rice, And so really what we see there is when we have so many words developing is it's pointing out the importance of something in a particular culture, whether it's rice or snow in these two examples. Now let's move on to the idea of grammar and syntax. Grammar and syntax are the rules of your language and the way that language is constructed. If we take, for example, the exclamation point, in the English language, we place that exclamation point at the end of a written sentence. So that really when you're reading, you get to the end of the sentence, and it's almost like you have to then go back and revise the whole sentence in your head, saying it with more emphasis after you've read the sentence. Well, that's a rule of our English language, and it didn't come about until the Gutenberg printing press started to spread the idea of using the exclamation point to emphasize a sentence or phrase or word. Whereas if you look at Spanish, the exclamation point comes upside down in the beginning of the sentence and at the end of the sentence, which is bringing to the reader a more readily accessible interpretation of the sentence, because you can see right away that you're supposed to emphasizing it. That's an example of a rule of our language. But the syntax also comes into play. It's how we construct our language. And as Fred Yant points out, we often construct the English language with a subject and a verb and then an object. That's often the typical construction of our sentences. And I have to say that those of you who have had Professor Cem Zeytinoglu in our department, he's from Turkey. He teaches most of the public relations courses. He told me once that in the English language, you use the word I to start sentences much more in Turkish, because Turkish is just not constructed that way. And so that's why many people in the United States, they start sentences by I, and a lot of the sentences are focused on themselves. It's not even necessarily that they're preoccupied with themselves or self-absorbed. It's that the language is actually encouraging that. That's the world that is created by the language of English. Next up is the idea of linguistic relativism. What this means is basically a critique of the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis. It's saying, in essence, that the world that we know is not necessarily determined by language. It's saying really that the linguistic characteristics of our language and the cultural norms that exist within our culture, they influence each other. It's not that one determines the other, it's that they influence each other. So when do you say thank you in English? If somebody pulls up in a car and asks you directions and you say, oh yeah, Walmart, it's down the road to the right and then take a left. And then they drive away without saying thank you, you might be kind of pissed about that, or at least a little bit irritated because they didn't say thank you. We expect that. It's a cultural norm and it influences what we expect somebody else to say. So that's what the linguistic relativism is all about. And it speaks, Pigeon speaks in this part of the chapter about coordinate bilingual speakers. Coordinate bilingual speakers are speakers who pick up a second language later in life, like myself. I speak a little bit of Spanish. I don't speak in past tense or future tense, but I speak enough to get around. Bastante, yo hablo bastante español. I speak enough Spanish. And it influences my thought processes, but it's not the same way as if you are a compound bilingual speaker. That's somebody who learns early on in life a second language, and it's almost as if you are developing two separate thought processes, because you are. Because language is thought. Many of you in this class will speak already a second language much better than I do. For many of you, it is Espanol, it is Spanish. And you know what I'm talking about. You speak about things differently. To give you an example, when was the last time you told somebody that you love them in English? Think about what you're doing when you're telling them that. You're doing something to them. You're saying, I love you. You're doing love to that person. Whereas in French and Spanish, and I believe Italian, the sentence construction is different. It's essentially saying, I, you, love. As in French, we say, je t'adore. Je is I, te is you, and then adore is love. So you're saying, I, you, adore. So in the Mediterranean languages or the Latin languages, you're putting the I and the you together first in the sentence, and then you're saying what both of you share in this particular piece of communication. In this example, it's love. This syntax really determines a lot of the meaning that comes out of language, and it has to do with linguistic relativism. There's an interesting case study that Fred Yarn goes into about Arabic and the Arab culture. He speaks about how Arabic was really derived from the holy text of Islam, which is the Quran. And when there was the Ottoman Empire and the spread of Islam throughout the whole European and Mediterranean and Arab, Middle Eastern regions, I don't know if you've read about the Ottoman Empire, came out of what we consider today to be modern-day Turkey. That's how Arabic was spread, and there are lots of differences. Oftentimes when you translate Arabic into English, it comes out as really dramatic and harsh. You can say, we missed you, if you're an English speaker and you're meeting a person who's a friend of yours who's Arabic, but when they translate it, it may come out as, you made us desolate with your absence. That's, again, getting back to the idea that sometimes there's no direct translation. But also in the Arabic language, the pitch and the rhythm is very important to the meaning of the language. It is the case also in English, but not as much as in Arabic. And it's been said that in Arabic language that yes means maybe, and maybe means no. And this is derived from the fact that saying no to somebody is considered to be impolite. And so Arabic peoples, generally speaking, are sometimes considered by English peoples not to be truthful. When actually what they're trying to do is to try to save you the face, we would say in our culture, of telling you no, that they won't do something by leaving an out that maybe it'll happen, but then it doesn't. And so really they meant no to begin with, but they had a difficult time saying it because of their cultural norms. I've already spoken about translation problems, but that's addressed next in the book. So I'm gonna move on, since I've spoken about that, to the various equivalencies that the book talks about, speaking about these as barriers, that there are no equivalencies. An equivalency is when something is exactly equal to something else. We know from what we've already talked about in this instructional video that there is no vocabulary equivalence for certain words. In the United States, a lot of times when people are expressing their excitement about something, they may say, "I'm ramped up." And that's not going to be translatable, because a ramp is something that, brings you onto a highway or launches a rocket. And in other countries and cultures, there's not going to be an equivalent for that. So there's translation problems, and there's vocabulary problems in terms of equivalence. But there's also idiomatic equivalence problems. An idiom is a saying that you have in your culture, like "it's raining cats and dogs," or "I'm afraid the old man kicked the bucket." And those are not translatable to other cultures, or to some other cultures. And so there is often no idiomatic equivalence when you're trying to understand another culture. Nor is there the next kind of equivalence sometimes, and that is experiential equivalence. When we're seeing the world through language, if you're sitting there at night and you suddenly see a meteor shower and you start to describe that to somebody else, and you describe it as a spray across the sky of streaking white lights, that's something that you experienced through your language, and you see the streaking white lights, whereas somebody sitting perhaps in Mexico may look at the sky, and they may see the sky in relation to the calendar, because Mexican peoples often studied the calendar. It was very important to Mayans and Aztec Indians. Those are ancient Mexican peoples, or indigenous Mexican peoples, and they were using the sky to chart the calendar, because that would help them harvest the crops that they needed to produce tortillas and other kinds of foods. And so a meteor shower that they may see, they may describe in terms of a day of the month, or in terms of the calendar month, or in terms of a year. So that has to do with experiential equivalence. There is none sometimes between cultures. And then there's the idea of conceptual equivalence, some abstract ideas. That's what a concept is. It's up here. A concept is something like the idea of forgiveness. You can't see forgiveness. You can see my shirt. That's a tangible idea, but an abstract concept is something you can't see. You have to use your head to wrap your head around it to understand it. And so, for example, the concept of socialism is very difficult for Americans to understand exactly what it is. And when we're taught about socialism here in the United States, we're often taught that it is automatically a very bad thing, where the state is interfering in your lives, etc. Whereas if you talk to a Swedish person, they may say, you know what, when a husband and wife have a baby, the husband should have as much right to have off of work to raise the baby as the mother, and not lose their job and still earn pay until they can go back to work. It's better for the child. And so a Swedish person may say that socialism to them is very, very different. And it speaks to the idea that there's a conceptual equivalence problem often when we try to understand other cultures through your own culture's eyes. The book then goes on to, the chapter I should say, then goes on to discuss how human and machine translators are advancing our understanding of other cultures. And many of you, for example, have already used Google Translate to try and translate documents and other things that you've come across on the web, and you're rooting around. And this presents, I think, a great opportunity for the world to understand each other better. But of course, Google Translate is often not going to translate things correctly, or at least accurately, as they were spoken about in other languages. Next, we're going to talk about the differences between Pigeon, Creole, and universal languages. A Pigeon language is what we might consider to be Spanglish, for example. Some of you speak Spanglish in your households. It's a mixture within a sentence of Spanish and English words. That's what a Pigeon language is. It's when two languages come together and they form a third language. And that's different from a Creole language, C-R-E-O-L-E, Creole language. You find Creole languages in the Caribbean very often, which was the center of slave trading, unfortunately. And we found a lot of different European languages that were mixing with native African languages. And so, for example, Portuguese is mixing also with languages out of West Africa. And what you end up with is a kind of a potpourri of languages where you're using words and phrases and the syntax or rules that are coming from all these languages. It's very interesting. Some of you may have patois spoken in your family, and you know what I'm talking about. Then there is this idea of a universal language. And in the 1800s in Poland, there was an idea of coming up with a universal language to make it easier for the world to communicate, and that was known as Esperanto. And this language would be used, it would use English to describe certain subject matters, for example, diplomacy, the idea of nations getting along. And it would use French language for something else, for example, to describe emotions. It never took hold, but it is still really interesting. And if there is a language that is as close today as a universal language, it is English. And Fred Yant explains that in the book, how English has, in a very short period of time, really gained world supremacy. About 1/4 or 1/5 of the entire world speaks some form of English. And we know that in certain spheres of language expression, the English is just completely dominant, and it's more than 1/4 of the world. For example, in media content that circulates around the world in terms of TV shows and songs that are sung on the radio, and films, that English has dominance. And one of the big reasons that English was spread was because of the British Empire, which controlled approximately 1/4 of the world in the 1800s through the British Navy. And when the British were conquering India and South Africa and Australia and the United States and lots of other places around the world, because of the supremacy of their navy, they also took with them the English language. So if there is a language that is universal, it's English right now, but it also leads us to become imperial in our nature, especially in the United States. How many of you in this class speak a second language? Until you really have to. Often people in the United States don't speak a second language. They want others, even when we go to another country, if we go to France or go to a China, go to somewhere exotic, Greece, not that the other two are not exotic, we expect people to be able to speak English to us. That's a kind of an imperialism. And that leads me to the final thought for today. The book ends with several very interesting case studies, which I'm going to invite you to dig into on your own. But the final thought I want to finish with today is language as nationalism. Nationalism is presenting the idea that if you want to belong to a nation state, you have to speak a language that is designated by the state as the official language. Otherwise, you're not truly an American. So if you're a Spanish speaker here in the United States first and an English speaker second, or maybe not at all, you're not really an American until you're an English speaker first. Go through any Chinatown in almost any big city in the United States, and you will find enclaves or communities of Chinese people who have been living and continuing traditions and serving foods and products that are out of China. And those communities often are not integrating into if you go to Philadelphia, there's a Chinatown. If you go to New York, there's a Chinatown. They're not often integrating to other parts of those cities. And so it becomes an issue for the country. Are those cultures Americans? That's what a lot of people ask themselves. Are they truly Americans if they do exist in their own private little world and are not participating in the American experience? There's no right or wrong answer to this. It's just the idea that language is sometimes used to enforce nationalism, to say that if you want to belong to the United States, you must speak English. If you want to belong to China, you must speak Mandarin. If you want to belong to France, you must speak French. In fact, the French actually have several laws that prohibit the importation of English language words. They don't want the French language to be diluted because the French language is a very flamboyant, expressive language, and it has certain nuances that the English language does not. In fact, French is still very much the language of diplomacy today. I saw in the newspaper yesterday that the president of France, Francois Hollande, He's going to be holding a United Nations summit, and it's no coincidence that it's being held in France because France has some nuances to the language, some delicacies that are able to try and mend fences. There's an idiom to try and bring people together. That's what diplomacy is all about, rather than divide them up to a point where countries have to go to war with each other. All right, so that will wrap things up for language as a barrier. I hope you have a great day.